His work describes, in his words, quote, the joining of heaven and earth and the role in that joining of dead human beings. So relic cults, of course, are also widespread throughout Buddhist Asia, a tradition said to have begun with the cremated remains of the historical Buddha in the 5th century BCE. But in my current project, I'm not thinking of corporeal relics, that is, Brown's dead human beings, but of literary relics. That is, the biographical works that make present their subject and engage with their community in the same visceral way as do bone fragments and fingernail clippings. So one example of literary relics I've been working on, but I won't really describe at length here, although I'm happy to talk about it more in the question and answer session, appears as an elaborate biographical text inscribed on the back of a hanging scroll portrait. So on the left, it's difficult to see with the lighting, it's kind of dark, but it's a portrait of Milarepa surrounded by a number of his disciples. And on the back of the painting is an extensive inscription, so handwritten in cursive Tibetan, in very fine script, which is basically a biography set in verse, and it's in the shape of a mortuary monument, a stupa, which I'll describe in a moment. And the inscription was basically used in the consecration or the vivification of the image. In such a context, I've argued elsewhere, the text here was not meant to be read, or at least not read in the way that literary narratives are traditionally read. And part of this was for the simple reason that the text is actually located on the back of the painting and would normally never be seen. So rather, the inscription formed a kind of literary relic. Here situated inside the mortuary monument, called the stupa, which is formed by the actual shaping of the text, and serves here to vivify the image, imbuing the portrait in the minds of a devoted community with the subject's living presence. And we get a fuller sense of what this is like if you conflate or overlay the front and the back of the image, where you see the body of the main portrait of Milarepa basically entombed within the structure of the monument, of the stupa, which is where the relics would typically go. So there's a well-known tradition culminating in India in the 6th or 7th century in which certain Buddhist verses were written on scrolls where they were believed to actually embody the Buddha himself, becoming manifestations of the Buddha's real presence, in the same way that relics were thought to infuse the living presence of the Buddha inside stupas, when placed inside stupas. So in such cases, the text was referred to by the name in Sanskrit, the Dharma Dhatu, which has been translated here in this context as a Dharma relic, or perhaps scriptural relic. And the acclaimed 7th century Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang noted the Indian practice of depositing scriptural fragments inside small stupas as a means of consecration. And here they were called by the Sanskrit term Dharma Sharira. So Dharma here refers to written scriptures, and the Sanskrit term Sharira is used primarily to designate the Buddha's relics in the form of corporeal remains. So thus, here we find a conflation of the text and body. We see literary corpus as a physical corpse. So all of this is by means of a preamble to the main topic at hand today, where I want to back up and present a new way of reading the life of Milarepa, and perhaps other sacred biographies as well, by foregrounding the process through which the narrative took shape, together with the discursive and hermeneutical tactics the author employed to effectively transform his text into a kind of literary relic. So to understand such literary works as a form of relic, I've begun imagining Milarepa's literary corpus as a kind of physical body. So Milarepa's death then brought with it a biographic rebirth, and soon the life story was repeated and rewritten. And as authors began suturing together the narrative threads of his biography, an image of the Yogin came into view. First skeletal, later incorporating more complex literary structures as sinews binding the body together. Comprehensive accounts later added layers of flesh, forming an increasingly lifelike representation until finally, late in the 15th century, like Pygmalion's Galatea from the cold grain of ivory, Milarepa's portrait embodied in the madman's creation was animated and brought to life. So in turn, I have imagined myself as adopting a form of biographical forensics, dissecting the literary corpus to reveal its underlying structures and explore their systemic relationships through which the body of literature coalesced. So I want to begin here with a very brief account of Milarepa's early biographical tradition. But I want to then quickly turn to a reading of the text in light of the relationship posited by the tradition between the madman and Yogin, or author and subject. And after introducing the madman's early career, I turn to his status as the Yogin's reincarnation. That is, as the recognized re-embodiment of Milarepa hundreds of years after the Yogin's death. And then I want to conclude with a close reading of the text's narrative frame in light of this conflation of subject and author. So the madman, I hope to show, employs the rhetoric of traditional Buddhist scriptures to effectively write himself into the story, not as a competing subject, but literally as the subject himself. And from this ultimate vantage point, the Yogin's first-person narration becomes the madman's own voice, unimpeachable and seemingly unmediated, as if speaking out directly to readers across the span of 400 years. So in one sense, the dissection of Milarepa's corpus forms its own narrative, that is a biography of the Yogin's life story. And I want to acknowledge from the outset that this story, that is my story that I'm telling here, like all forms of life writing, maintains its own literary conceits. So just as founding figures of religious traditions rarely understood themselves as founders, that is a position usually projected upon them by subsequent devotees, the authors of early biographical works did not understand their texts as fragments waiting to be integrated into a larger whole. So the image of a biographical body here, as I'm imagining it, comes into view with the madman's work, and through its lens, the body appears anatomically complete. So the madman has effectively reshaped the way in which the earlier versions of the life story are understood. So the fact is, Jorge Luis Borges once reflected, each author creates his own precursors, and his work modifies our conception of the past as it will modify the future. And indeed, early texts of Milarepa's biographical tradition may have been fragmentary, but they were not fragments until retrospectively cast in the light of a fully formed corpus. And it is the madman who served to rewrite the Yogin's past by incorporating early texts of the tradition into his own work. And in the face of this creation, the early biographical tradition all but slipped out of sight. So from a death to a biographical rebirth. The life of Milarepa concludes with the following vignette describing events from the Yogin's death. Dawn breaks on the morning after Milarepa's cremation, and one of his longtime followers awakens from a wondrous but disheartening dream. Celestial maidens were carrying off his master's mortal remains, his relics, in the form of a radiant sphere of light. Anxious, he rouses his fellow disciples, and together they peer into the cremation in the cremation cell, shown here on the left, only to find the chamber is empty. Neither ashes nor bone remain, and gone too are the sacred pearl-like relics, causing even greater dismay. Celestial goddesses had swept clean the Yogin's every physical trace, leaving nothing behind. Heartbroken, the assembly instead inherits the Yogin's few worldly possessions, a cap, a walking staff, strips of his cotton robe. And I just want to emphasize that the episode of Milarepa's death and the lack of physical cremations is really a crucial element in the story. It's really understood as fundamentally important that the humans were not seen as being fit to maintain or retain Milarepa's relics, so they were left with no relics whatsoever. But in addition to these everyday items that they did retain, Milarepa's followers and patrons also kept stories of the Yogin's life, his travels, his ascetic practices, and especially his poetry. And if the Yogin's mortal remains had vanished from sight, his life would take shape once again through the gradual recording and reworking of the stories of his life. So what might have first decomposed was eventually recomposed through the gradual codification of his biographical corpus. This corpus emerged first as rudimentary outlines. They were narrative fragments recorded by early disciples and perhaps written down within a generation of his death in the late 12th century. They resemble notes hastily scribbled and have almost none of the formal properties of sacred biography as it came to be understood in Tibet. Over time, the skeletal frame was fleshed by a new genre of literature, a form of